Hello. So I'm going to show you how to make a website with SvelteKit and AWS. And this is how I've made my website, nabware.com. And these are just my talking points so I know what I'm supposed to be talking about. So React to Svelte. So I tried React first because that's the most popular web framework. And then I discovered Svelte. And the reason I picked Svelte mainly was that it had a smaller binary size when you build it, and there's no DOM, so I felt that one, it's less complicated to develop in, and that probably helps with latency. And then there's Svelte and SvelteKit. So the reason I chose SvelteKit was for it has built-in routing. And for those who don't know, routing is like the way your web app handles different paths within your application. For example, if I click this account button, the URL resolves to nabware.com/account. So anyway, you need a router to kind of handle this. And so SvelteKit has that built in, so I thought it would be a good idea, a good reason to pick that. Let's see, any other closing thoughts on this? I will say, I understand that SvelteKit it's being developed to run on a node, not necessarily to be hosted as a static single page application. But yeah, I wanted the built-in routing. And I am thinking of implementing an account page, as you can see on the website here. But I'm going to be using AWS to handle the backend stuff. My reasoning for that, with a node, pricing, so you'll always, if a node is constantly running, you'll have to pay for that. Whereas with the static page and using a lot of the AWS services, they have on-demand pricing a lot of the time. So if nobody's using it, you even if a small amount of people are using it, it's essentially free at very low traffic. Okay, so let's move on to installing SvelteKit. So you'd go to kit.svelte.dev or just Google SvelteKit, and you'll end up on a page like this. And if you scroll to the bottom here, you'll see some commands. So there are dependencies you'll need, like npm. I'm not going to go over that. So you run npm, you run this command, and then install it. And then if you look to the left, well, my left, it'll populate your directory with a bunch of files. So we can go over that. Well, I guess the next thing is the npm run dev command. So let's go to the package.json where our scripts are. Here's your build command. So by default, it's going to look something like this. SvelteKit build. Oh, I'm sorry. We're doing the dev command. Okay, I didn't change that. Anyway, this is how we're going to run our website locally and test for changes. So let's see if I can just do that right now. So you'll see it says localhost 3000. So that's where it's going to be running. Yeah, and well, it looks just like my actual website, obviously. So that's just kind of how you get started. So we'll just end this. So let's talk about some of the files here. to help us build our website. So by default, you'll have a folder called routes. And, I don't remember if they put index.svelte in there by default. But anyway, the way this works, and which is kind of cool as far as routing is concerned, is SvelteKit will take the name of the Svelte file, and that'll be the path. So for example, let's take terms of service.svelte. So that's a file with my terms of service document, essentially. If I go to my website and type in nabware.com/terms of service, it routes to that page. So the name of the file, the Svelte file in this routes folder, will be the path of the page, except for this layout file. So now we can talk about this layout file. So the layout file, you could think of it as kind of the root level of your website. So we have three sections here: header, main, and footer. And if you look on my website, the header is this top part where my Nabware logo is. The main are these 5 links right here. And the footer are these 4 links at the bottom. And so the header and the footer will remain whichever page you're at. So if I click account, for example, you'll notice those 5 links disappeared, but you still have the header and the footer here. So yeah, and you can design this however you want. As in, you can, whatever you think should be in the header and footer, that's your choice to make. So under that, we have our style tags. So this is where we make it look nice. Actually, let me remove this or comment it out. Let me run npm run dev. And then let's just see what it looks like. Oh, 3000. Okay, so as you can see, without the styling, this is what this will look like. You'll notice that I'm using links instead of, I have used buttons, the button tag, this, in the past. But I think for like search engines and their web crawlers, I think if you have links, it's better for whatever the search engine terminology is. Search engine, not optimization. Well, maybe it's SEO. So I think using the A tags is the way to go. However, we want it in a button format so that on mobile devices you don't have to click these tiny links. So let's uncomment our style. So I'm just going to go through this line by line. So the first few lines, you'll see I'm importing 2 fonts here. So for the whole website, I want the Roboto font. And this is all from Google. If you just Google Fonts, there's a website and you can select a bunch of fonts. So in one link, I'm pulling the Roboto font and the Russo 1 font. The Russo 1 font is my Nabware logo at the top. The second link here, I'm importing Font Awesome. that's how I'm getting these tiny logos next to each of the social platforms and down here where the documents in the account are. Font Awesome has a bunch of awesome. I don't even know if they have fonts, but they have icons. So that I'm importing that. So those are the kind of two imports I have. And then I make some declarations of how I want to style the whole website. So here I'm saying for all body tags, I want to set the margin to 0. So if I don't have this, you'll notice my header, there's like a little gap. So by default, I believe the body tag has a margin. I don't want that. So that's why I have that. Then I'm declaring that I want to align the text of the header in the center, and I gave it a background color. So again, if I don't have that, well, you can't see it, but yeah, the logo goes to the left. I want it to be in the center. Website name, so that's the site logo up top. Because it's an A tag, a hyperlink, I want to remove the text decoration, which is like the underline you get. Color, white, font size, and then this is where you set that Russo 1 font that I imported up here. So you would just you'd set the font family parameter with Russo 1 sans serif. And where I got this actually, let me pull this website up real quick. Google Fonts. Okay, so you look to the right, so it still has my selections from before. So if you look to the right, there's a section that says use on the web. You can select import because I'm importing it in a style tag. So I just copy and pasted this, and then this is how it tells you to use the fonts. So I just copy and pasted that. Moving on. Okay, so same thing. I could, instead of, for the header, main, and footer, I want the font to be Roboto, but you could probably do it in the body instead and then just get rid of this. Let's see if that works. Okay, that seems to work. So I might do that. I'm not gonna commit any changes right now, but yeah, I think that's cleaner. Main. So I'm setting the margin to auto. I'm giving it some padding. So let me describe why I did these things. So the max width 960. I believe 960 is a standard width. I've seen it around on the internet. It also is just, it's the reason I have this. Let's see, how do I explain this? Let me disable it and let's see what happens. Okay, well, it doesn't look that bad, but if you don't have a max width, the problem is your content, if you're in a full screen like this, your content gets moved all the way to the left, and I want it to stay relatively in the center. So that's max width in combination with the margin auto, because if I don't have the margin auto, then I will get the width is now reduced, but it's to the left and I want it centered. And then the padding is for mobile devices specifically. So if I do Control-Shift-I here, and I click this little button that says Toggle Device Toolbar, you'll notice that on a phone, the content will be pressed up against the edge of the screen. So we just add a padding. And I looked at other websites just to test this, and they seem to be about 20 pixels. So that's what I set that to. Okay, and then I set a global class called link button. So all these gray links buttons you see, this is how I styled it. So block is used, I think by default, it's either none or inline. Block takes up like the whole row, you can call it, I guess. So as you can see, if I don't have block, everything gets smushed like this. Padding is for making the button, making the link into a button size. I think I just took this off a tutorial site. You can set this to whatever you want, obviously. Background is the color. Color is the font color. And I guess I don't have to explicitly, no, I do have to explicitly state that here, because look what happens otherwise. You get that's the hyperlink defaults. Text decoration, similar to the logo up top. Text align center, I want it to be centered. Margin, 20 pixel, and then auto. So there's different ways you could tackle this. You could set this parameter in the main. Could you set it in main? Well, anyway, there's multiple ways you could accomplish centering these buttons, but this is how I chose to do it. I have no other reasoning. And the way to read this is when you're setting margin or even padding, the way it works is you can do something like this. And what this is doing is you're setting padding top, padding left, padding bottom and right. And I believe it goes top, left, bottom, right. Look into that to make sure I'm correct on that. So what this is doing is saying we want 20 pixel padding on the top and then auto for the rest. So as you can see, if I just do auto here, the buttons, they'll be centered as I wanted them, but now they're crammed together and I want to create some space. So I just set it to 20 pixels. And then width is the width of the button. If you don't set this, as you can see, it's going to take up the whole width of its parent. So the main, I set it to 960, so those ones are stuck at 960. These bottom ones, the footer, it'll just be the whole width of the screen. So we just set it to 250, and I pulled up Control-Shift-I. I pulled up this mobile view, and you just kind of play around with it to see which one fits. Okay, so that's the layout page. Let's move on to the index. So now we're talking about kind of making the pages of our website. So I'm going to pull up the index page. So you'll notice at the top here, Svelte has a tag. I don't know if you call it a tag or I don't know what you would call this, but you can set the head tag. Now, this is different than header. Head is in HTML documents. Well, here, let's see if I can pull it up. Here we go. It looks very ugly, but you make some definitions to help your browser render your page the way you want it to. Like, for example, setting a meta tag with the character set UTF-8 and different other things. So when we change our pages, there's a few tags that you'd want to change to reflect the page you're on. So here I set the title, I set this meta tag. You can look into if this makes a big difference or not in search engine optimization, but I just throw it in there. And then same with this link. So actually I'll demo this right now. Let me open up a second page here. So on the account page, you'll notice the same block, except the title is different and the other parts are different. So if you take a look here, you'll notice we're on the index page, which is just the home, and you'll notice it just says nabware. But if I click account, it switches to account-nabware. So that's just the reason for this whole block, basically. Well, specifically for this title tag, but the other ones do the same thing behind the scenes accordingly. Okay, and then in the index page, the rest of this is just the links. Let me pull up the index page again. If you click on the nabware logo, it brings you back. So for now, I just want to link to my social media platforms and software distribution platforms. So it's just a set of links. And then within the link, you'll notice I have an I tag here. So this is a font. Well, I tag may not be a font awesome thing, but this is where I'm inserting these logos or these icons for each of the links. So you would put in I in the class, and you have to go to the Font Awesome website and search for the icon you want, and then it'll tell you what class it is, and then you just copy and paste that here. And then I have 2 white spaces in between so that the text is not pressing up against the icon. So that's the index page. Okay, the account page. So the account page is, well, coming soon. So that's that. So I guess I can move on from that. Let's just close this here. Okay, so we're going to move on to the svelte.config.js. So we need to make some changes here because we're making a SPA, a single page application. And, well, I'm not even sure that's why we're doing this. The other reason is, by default, remember, SvelteKit is being developed to run on a node instance, not as a static website. So by default, it does not generate an index.html page, and we need that for our project here. So what you do is you comment out the default adapter. So you have to change the adapter. I'm not 100% sure what adapters are, but you can look that up. But we need this adapter static. So you comment out the first one and you paste this here. And then by default, there are no options in this adapter function call. So you have to add the fallback parameter and then add in index.html. This will be the name. This tells the adapter to generate an index file, which if you take a look at this build folder here and you look down here, it's not going to look this messy actually by default. I'm going to explain why it looks so messy, but anyway, this is where that will go. So that's the extent to changing the config file for this project. So let's move on. Build command. So let's go to the package.json folder. So this is where you wouldn't use this. I mean, you can use it locally, but we want continuous integration, mainly continuous deployment. I don't know if it counts as continuous integration if you're only one person, but we want to implement continuous deployment. So we're going to have GitHub Actions run the build command and upload the build programmatically. Okay, so by default, as you can see, and to run this, you type in npm run build. So by default, the build command will look something like this: SvelteKit build. And I've added some commands here. So let me go through this. So favicons.js. So I've learned that I think it's pronounced favicon or favicon, but I kind of like favicon. So I might go back and forth between that pronunciation. Favicons are these little icons you see if you look at my browser and you look at the tab on the left-hand side of the Nabware text. There's my Nabware logo, basically. So different browsers have different like sizing requirements, and even beyond browsers. Yeah. So we want to auto-generate the favicons and put them in our build folder, because by default that's not going to happen by itself. So there's a package called favicons on npm. Let's just quickly look it up. npm favicons. Okay. Then they have their GitHub page here. So anyway, this will take a favicon PNG and it'll just spit out all the different sized favicons. So this one was kind of challenging. I guess I just don't have that much experience with using node packages, but my first inclination is, how do I include this in the SvelteKit, in my Svelte app? Maybe how do I, in the layout Svelte, how would I include this here? But what I did was, I created a node script, okay? And this just runs. This is how I'm calling it in the build script. I'm calling it after the SvelteKit build. So this says SvelteKit build and meaning only continue if this was successful. Node favicons.js. So here's the favicons.js file. So I just copy and pasted this whole thing. I actually technically probably got it from their GitHub page. I don't know if they're any different, but so I pasted this. Again, the layout is a little bit different. So they have three. See, I don't even understand how this works exactly. As in, if you look closely, let me make this bigger. And again, this is just probably due to my lack of experience with Node, and yeah. So they're importing it, or they're using require, which is like an older way to import, I guess, import packages. And then they just have a comma and they start declaring or defining these parameters within inline. So this wasn't working with how I couldn't figure it out. So what I did was I changed this to import, the import style, right? So I imported the favicons library up here. And then I imported these two packages as well. FS is file system. That comes with Node by default, so you don't need to install that necessarily. But you would need to run like npm I favicons, and I think it's just npm I node HTML parser. Yeah. And then I'll explain where I'm using these two specifically. So I left pretty much everything as defaults from my copy and paste of the favicons demo. I did make some changes though. So first of all, the source. Oh, even before the source, I took the three parameters that they're defining in line, and I made them separate parameters by adding let in front of it. So I'm defining variables in this script. So the source, I changed it to static/favicon.png. So by default, my Svelte package, when I installed it, it came with this folder and it came with a favicon.png. Now I made my own with Streamstamp, which is a cool application I made. You could check it out on my itch page, itch.io page. It's a thumbnail generator, but you can also make logos. Anyway, that's my plug. So I put my own favicon in there, and then I changed the source path to static/favicon.png. The configuration object, the only thing I changed was the app name and the app description. So by default, these are null, but when I ran the server, when I hosted the website, I was getting warning messages in the console saying the manifest file does not have an app name or an app description. And now I need to tell you what the manifest file is. This configuration helps generate a file called manifest.webmanifest. And again, this is another search engine optimization thing. You can look into the details as to what this actually does, but it's being generated, so I'm going to have it on my website. And as you can see, it creates a JSON object. So those are the two things I changed, app name and app description. Oh, and I also changed the background and theme color to I have a gray. You'll notice everything is gray here, the buttons and the header. So I use the same value for the background and theme color. And this affects images like this, where it stretches it beyond the dimensions or the aspect ratio of your original favicon. And if you don't change that color, I think it defaults to white. So you just change it to whatever you want, really. Okay, and I'm just going to scroll through this. I just want to check to see if I changed anything else. That's all I changed. Now, so we've gone over the source variable and the configuration variable of this favicons package. The callback variable/function. This is where we are going to generate these files. So by default, the favicons package, it's going to spit out three things. It's going to spit out a response object. It's going to give you the images, and then within the images, you'll have the name of the image file. You'll also have the buffer data, the raw data in bytes of the actual image. So we need to take that and build it into a file, okay? Let me just go over the other things that the response object gives you before I tell you how I go through each one. The response object will also give you files. So these are not the images. These are the things like browser.config.xml, manifest.webmanifest, and probably this Yandex browser manifest.json. So that'll also give you the name of the file. It'll give you not the byte data, but the content data in string format. And it tells you even here in these console logs that I've commented out, it tells you what it's going to be returning. An array of blah, blah, blah. And then the last thing that the favicons package will give you is the tags you need to include in your index.html file to reference the image files and the probably the manifest files and the XML files. And that's, I'll open up the index file here, index.html. So that's why this thing is just messy, is because I'm appending the index file with that information that favicons is giving us. So now let me walk through how I did that. So this is where that FS package comes in. I want to say it's file server. I don't know. It's included with Node. So I'm writing a file. You call write file, which you're going to create a file for each. Well, let me take a step back. I'm looping through each of the image objects in images. Okay. And then I'm calling fs write file. It's going to be in the build folder because by default, when I run the SvelteKit build command, it's going to put everything in build. So that's where I want these images. So build / the name of the image file, and then the next parameter is the contents. And the next parameter, you can state, here, let's see if I can do a quick lookup here. npm, write file. Okay, so it's the name of the file, the data, and then options. And then options is like you can specify the encoding. So I think I found this answer on Stack Overflow. So I have binary here because it is binary. It's not a string. So that's why I have that here. You can test out different options to see if that's even necessary, but it works. And then you have if there's an error function, I just left it blank for now. So that's how we're generating the raw images of all our favicons. Okay. The next step is the files. So it's done in a similar fashion. The only difference here is I didn't specify binary as a parameter. Here. Okay, but it's essentially the same thing. And then the last part is the injecting the tags into our index.html. So this is where I needed the next package, Node HTML parser, and then specifically their parse function. So we start by reading the existing HTML file. Okay, this is how you do that. We then parse that HTML file into an object with the parse function. And then, so remember, we want to inject these tags into the head tag, under the head tag. So again, this head tag is similar to the head tag we mentioned earlier, where I was changing the title and this meta tag and this link. So we're just adding to the index head. So we say root.querySelector head and store that in a variable. So now we have the head object in a variable. And then similar to how we did for the images and the files, we're going to iterate through the response.html, and it'll be, as stated here, an array of strings HTML elements. So we're going to iterate through that, and we're just going to add on to the inner HTML property of the head tag. I tried append and append child. That expects an object, I believe, and this is raw. This is a string, so this is the way I got it to work. So after we inject those tags, we write to file. You do that. So the way you get the contents of what we just did is you call root, which is the parsed HTML, and then toString. You're basically taking the whole file again, the whole file again, your modifications, and writing it to the file. And yeah. So that's that. Okay, let's see what the next step is here. That was pretty long, but so that's a pretty cool package. Favicons is a cool package. So next thing we're going to talk about is sitemap URLs. Again, another search engine optimization thing. And what I'm referring to here is the sitemap.xml file. This is another file that exists on websites to help search engines figure out what pages you have, I guess. And so to generate that file automatically, we're using another package called sitemap. You can find that on npm. It's probably npm this thing, npm I sitemap. Now, this we can call without writing a separate script, so to speak. So we do npx, and again, I'm pretty novice when it comes to Node, but my understanding is that npx is a way to get to execute a package without downloading the contents of it somewhere. I think that's how it works. So you call this npx sitemap and you feed it a file, a text file. I've called it sitemap dash urls.txt. And it's just a text file with all the pages of my website. So you would add yours. And then we want to spit this out, so we change the bracket direction. So you'll notice this direction means you're feeding in the information. This one means you're spitting it out to this file. So again, the build folder, because that's where SvelteKit's going to put everything. And we name it sitemap.xml. So that one's a little more straightforward. And then I'll talk about the static folder. So anything in the static folder will automatically be copied to build when you run SvelteKit build. So a copy of the favicon will go there. Originally, the way I had wanted to handle my legal documents was to keep them as a text file and just copy them there, and then on the footer of the layout page, of just the layout, I would have the links go to the text file. However, I noticed that the browser was, I guess this is the nature of having, the text file would show up on the browser, but some of the characters were misinterpreted. And I guess that's the nature of browsers, right? They're designed to render HTML files, and the HTML files help define the character set and these sorts of things. So I converted them into their own pages, which is what you see here. So yeah, but I still have them in the static folder. They're there, so technically you could see these files if you manually search for them and download them. But that's the static folder. Anything in here is going to be copied into the build folder when you run the build command. Okay, so that's the website in essence. Now we're going to move on to the AWS side of things, the infrastructure. So let me just close some of these tabs. Let's open up template.yml. Okay, so this is a AWS SAM. SAM stands for Serverless Application Model template. It looks very similar. It is very similar to a CloudFormation template. CloudFormation is it's a microservice by AWS that allows you to spin up resources, infrastructure resources that you need, like databases or CDNs, these kind of things. So there's two commands that you use if you're using SAM specifically, which is what I'm using, is SAM build and SAM deploy. So whenever you make a change to this, you need to run SAM build. That will build this template.yml file, and I believe it places it in this .aws-sam folder. And then you run SAM deploy to deploy the infrastructure. The first time you run SAM deploy, I would run it with the guided parameter so that you can define the parameters. If you don't, I believe it'll just try to run it with no parameters and then it'll error out. I'm not sure actually, but that's my advice. And obviously there's like a lot of setup with this. Like you need to, I'm not that much setup, but you need to install the AWS CLI. You need to configure your account. So for example, what I did is I have my root AWS account, and then I created a user. I just named it my name. And then I gave it like full access permissions to the things I'm using. And usually what I do is when I add a new resource, I'll just add it and run it and let it fail. And then in the error message, it'll say you don't have permission to do this specific thing. And then I take that info, find the permission, not necessarily that specific permission because there's usually a set of permissions you'll need, but I select the kind of AWS has pre-configured permissions, and they're just big groups of permissions. So I just select the one that I think is relevant to what I need. So yeah, you need to configure that. You need to configure the AWS CLI, and then you'll be ready to go. So the first part of this file is the parameters. So we'll need GitHub org, which is just your GitHub username, in my case. The GitHub repo, it's just the name of the repo. The OIDC provider ARN. So you can, what this is, this is a way that for AWS to know who GitHub is, because we'll be calling functions from GitHub directly from the GitHub Actions, and AWS needs to know who GitHub is. So in AWS IAM, you can go to I believe it's identity providers, and I would add GitHub as an identity provider. And you can Google kind of how to do that. But I would do that beforehand. You can also define it in this template. However, I prefer to do it this way so that other projects I may have can also use this provider. Then domain name, that's another thing you need to set up beforehand. And again, You might be able to do it in CloudFormation, but I would just do it in the console. And so yeah, you would need to buy a domain name in this case. So this would be the domain name like nabware.com. And then ACM certificate. So this is like SSL certificate. Again, another thing I'd set up beforehand. This specifically because it like takes time to verify, and that'll like could slow down your deployment. So once you set that up, copy and paste the ARN into the parameter. And you'll do that when you run SAM deploy, SAM build, and then SAM deploy guided. It's going to ask you for the parameters. And then you can have it saved to a file. And by default, it's samconfig.toml. So then you could just run SAM deploy. It'll remember all your parameters. Okay, so those are the parameters we'll need. The next section you'll see here is outputs. So this is just, it'll spit out the kind of names that I will need for our GitHub workflow. So I have the website bucket, the website CloudFront ID, the website CloudFront domain name, and the GitHub Actions Role. Again, I'm going to explain what all these things are, but just know that the outputs is basically once it's done deploying, it's going to spit out these values on your terminal and in the console. So if you need that information in one place to paste it into other places, and then you'll have it. Okay, so the meat and potatoes, resources. So first of all, we need a website bucket. So AWS has a service called S3, and they call these things buckets. It's basically a place to store files. And by default, it has a bunch of properties. The only ones I found relevant for my project is to block public access. So I guess apparently by default, you could access the S3 bucket directly, but I don't want that. I want users to access it only through the CloudFront Distribution, which is a CDN, which is I think it's Content Delivery Network. I don't remember exactly, but I want them to only access the files through that and not directly to the bucket. So that's the website bucket. Then is the CloudFront Distribution. So I'm going to go through these properties one by one. And again, all these things I'm going to go through, these resources, they'll probably have other parameters or properties that I may not have set because I just don't need them. But if you need something, just go to the documentation and just check it out and see the other properties. So default root object, I want index.html. That's the root of our website. Enabled, funny enough, you have to set this to true, I believe. Otherwise, it won't be enabled by default. Origins, okay. I want to think of a way to maybe explain this in plain English. Okay, so origins are basically sources that your CloudFront can direct your traffic to, basically. You can think of it that way. We only have one origin, which is the website bucket, okay? But you can set a list of origins. So we just gave it an ID, the domain name. So the domain name is you need to set it to the S3 regional domain name. So the buckets have domain names. You need to set it to that. And I guess let me explain what this GetAtt is for those who don't know. You'll see two things. Again, multiple ways to reference like resources. Basically, each... Ooh, this is tough. This is tough to explain. Teaching is hard. Basically, if you need an attribute from a resource, you can do !get@, the resource name, sorry, here, which is what I defined as website bucket. And then there are different attributes that you can refer to. Here in this case, it's regional domain name. Let me just pull up the docs real quick so I can show you what I'm talking about. So if you just Google the resource type, you can see the docs here. And on the right, you click return values. Okay, so if you call ref, there's two things you can call: GetAtt, which is what we're doing. You can call ref as well instead of GetAtt, and it'll give. If you just need the ID, you call ref. If you need another specific property, you call GetAtt. But this return value section will tell you for each resource type what can get returned. So here it returns a domain name, but it also returns a regional domain name, which is what we want, apparently. Although I wonder if it would work with domain name too. I'm not sure, but it's working with this. And then we have the configuration for the origin. And again, as I've stated, all these properties, they're listed in the documentation. And what I normally do to figure out like what I need to declare when I'm first starting is I do Control F, required, yes. Okay? So it'll tell you if it's required or not. So I just go through the yes ones, and then sometimes even that, like, you'll try to deploy it and you'll still get errors and say, oh, you need to define some other thing for this reason, and you kind of go through that process. So sorry for the tangent. Let's go back. S3 origin config. So I'm configuring an access identity. So now I guess let me tell you what an access identity is. So you can Google this, as you can with everything. This is how we get access to our bucket. So I've blocked all public access, but I want just the CloudFront requests to have access. So here we're defining the origin access identity, and we have created an origin access identity. And if I skip down, you'll notice it's right here. CloudFront origin access identity. Again, you just set the type. I added a comment, and then we have it. And then you can reference it right here. And that is going to give our CloudFront access to the bucket. Well, now I'm thinking, I don't know if it gives us access to it or restricts the access to only CloudFront. It's one of those two. So the next property is default cache behavior. So default cache behavior is, so in a CloudFront distribution, you have origins, as we stated, which are the sources. Then you have the cache behaviors, which is, well, one, it defines how CloudFront caches the content, but it also defines the pathing, like the URL pathing, okay? So default cache behavior, think of it as nabware.com/, wildcard, okay? Which means for any URL, this is what's going to happen, okay? Unless I define other cache behaviors like account, well, I don't want to confuse you with this, but you can set up different paths to go different places if you didn't want it to go to the website. So that's what a cache behavior is. It defines kind of the pathing and also how CloudFront caches things. So I've set the origin ID, which I defined previously. So that's the target origin ID. I defined the viewer protocol policy so that there's no HTTP requests. Everything gets redirected to HTTPS. And I've set a cache policy ID. This is the recommended way. Sorry. I believe there's multiple ways you can. Well, anyway, I've defined a cache policy and I've defined it down here. This is just your, think of it as your default cache policy. Meaning, well, let me go through the properties. Default TTL, time to live. So the way the CloudFront works is that, you know, you request index.html. CloudFront says, let me check my cache. Oh, no, we don't have anything in here. So let's go to the bucket, the S3 bucket, and we'll give it to you. After we give it to you, we're going to hold on to it in our cache so that the next person that comes, we'll just give them that instead of sending them to the bucket every time. The default TTL is how long it's going to hold that file in cache. So this is all in seconds, and I believe it's either 1 hour or 1 day. And then you set max and min. You give it a name. I just gave it the name of the stack. So I guess I didn't explain what stacks are. CloudFormation, the way it works is when I deploy this template, I'm deploying it as a stack. You're going to define the stack name when you run that SAM deploy guided. And we can reference the stack name by saying ! ref AWS : stack name. Okay. Parameters in cache key and forwarded to origin. Again, these are different ways. So cookies, I have nothing, there's no cookie, do nothing about cookies, do nothing about header behaviors, do nothing about query string behaviors. I'm not going to go through the details of that stuff. They're just set to none. And these are like compression things. I set them to true. It's basically like CloudFront will automatically zip stuff and then send it to your browser in a compressed format. It's probably because it's faster and it's smaller file sizes. And then your browser like uncompresses it behind the scenes and then serves it to you. I believe that's how that works. So that's some information on that. So let's go back to our CloudFront distribution. So that's the cache policy we've set, okay? That's the default cache behavior. HTTP version 2 is the latest one. 1 is the previous one. Aliases. Okay, so this is like CNAMEs. So this is how we tell... so we have our domain name. Mine is nabware.com. And I have it through AWS Route 53 service. You have to go to Route 53 and basically point this domain to our CloudFront distribution. And that's where you would paste the output of I think it's the domain name. So you have to set up an alias record in the DNS configuration, but you also need to add an alias or a CNAME for the CloudFront distribution so that when I say nabware.com, it's showing me nabware.com and not just the CloudFront will have its own URL, something dot probably cloudfrontaws.com. But we don't want that to show up. We just want our domain to show up. So we have to declare our domain name as an alias. Viewer certificate. So this is the SSL certificate. Again, you would have handled this beforehand, and we're defining it here. Minimum protocol version. This seems to be the latest and greatest, or recommended. A lot of this is recommended stuff. Comment. I just add a comment, the stack name, so that if I have to manually go in the console and I'm looking through the distributions, I'll know what stack this distribution is associated with. And this part's kind of important. So custom error responses. So we have a single page application, okay? Technically, all we have is an index.html. Okay, so when I say nabware.com/account, there's no file called account or account.html. So by default, CloudFront will give you a 404. However, in our case, because we're restricting access to the bucket, I was going to say because we're restricting access to the the S3 bucket, that it gives us a 403 instead of a 404. 404 is like not found. 403 is not authorized. Technically, it's not found, but I have a feeling it's not. The not authorized is being overridden because of some of these permissions we've set. Anyway, that's a problem for us because I want users to be able to go to nabware.com/account and it resolve properly as opposed to giving you an error. So what we do is we set up a custom error response. So the error code that you would get is 403. So for that error code, response page path is index.html. So for all 403s, CloudFront is going to serve this index.html file. And then also I say change the response code to 200. So you could do it without this, but then in the console you'll still get 403 errors. Just to clean that up, I change it to a 200 code. Now this can be problematic because you're now hiding, in a sense, you're hiding all the 403 errors. And you, by default, you really do want to know when errors are happening because you could accidentally hide legit 403 errors. And there's other problems that can arise. As long as your CloudFront is only being used for the single page application, I don't think that should be a problem. The second you start doing other things with backend APIs, I would probably just create a separate distribution for that. So yeah, we need this for our single page application. Okay, so that's our CloudFront distribution. We discussed CloudFront cache policy. We discussed CloudFront origin access identity. Website bucket policy. Okay, so besides the fact that we're letting CloudFront access the bucket with the access identity, you still need to declare more permissions. So you're allowing CloudFront to access it, but you haven't defined what it can do. So the only thing we want CloudFront to do in this project is to get files, which is this action, get object. So let's maybe walk through this. So again, we declared the type. We're referencing our buckets. So we need to define the bucket, and then policy document. So again, this is like a standard format for a lot of AWS permissions. You can look it up, but anyway, we have our statement, and then we have a list of actions. So we only have one action here. We're saying the action is S3 get object. And again, you might ask, how did I know that that was the action? It's trial and error, or it's Google searching. And even that is like, it's not that clear a lot of the times, but eventually you'll find it. Effect, you could do allow or deny. We want to allow it. And then resource. So we want to, so this is the, think of it as the path within the bucket. So we just want the whole, access to the whole bucket, all the files. So you'll see here I have a join command, okay? So this is a new command here. I want to reference the website bucket ARN, which is the resource number, but I also need to specify the path as this / and then the asterisk, which wildcard, which means all of them, all the paths, all the files. So in order to join these two strings, you call a join function. The first parameter is what you want to add between the strings, the list of strings. So if I put a colon, it would add a colon in between every item it's joining together. But in this case, I don't want anything. So that's that parameter. Then this next parameter is the list of separated values. So it's the ARN and the path / and the path. And then principal is who is this policy assigned to? And again, we want to reference the CloudFront access identity. So, yeah. And I don't remember why it's AWS here, but that should be in the documentation. Okay, that's the website bucket policy. Okay, so now we have GitHub Actions Role. So we want to do continuous deployment, which means when I make changes to the website, I want to do git add all, or git add whatever, git commit, make your commit, and then git push. And once I push, I want GitHub Actions to build the website and push it to my bucket. But we need AWS there needs to be a role that allows GitHub to execute the commands, the AWS commands. So that's what this role is. So let's just go through this here. Assume role policy document. So here we're creating a statement. We're saying allow assume role with web identity. Sorry, I'm just trying to think. I'm trying to just think through how this exactly fits in, because I kind of forgot. Well, I must have figured this out through, well, a Google search, obviously. But okay, let's just go through this. So STS assume role, so that's the action. The principal is the OIDC provider arm. That's what I said to set up beforehand. So we'll have that arm. That's the identity. And then condition string like token. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I can't really explain this part. You're just gonna have to take my word for it. I must have read a tutorial and some documentation either on GitHub's site or AWS's site, and this is what they said to do. I don't know how to put it into English because I don't understand what's happening in the background with this, but this is just a way to allow GitHub Actions to like upload to our buckets and do the other actions. So just, yeah, you can look this up on your own or just copy this directly. Sub is a template command or reference so that I can type in a string and then type in these, and type in this $ with the curly brackets and then my parameter name, which is up top here. So I can reference that in a string by using the sub command. And then the policies, we just have one policy, and this is where we define what GitHub Actions can do. So again, similar to previously when I said, how do you know which actions? It's a lot of like trial and error and Googling, but we're going to run several commands. So we're going to have GitHub run AWS S3 sync, which is like a way to synchronize the files from one place into your bucket. And so instead of just copying the files over, I also want to delete old files that maybe no longer exist. So that's why you use the S3 sync command. So that's why we need the delete action as well as the put action, which if you were just using, I think it's S3 CP, then you could just have that. But that's why we need the delete object. Then we define the path, the resource. Again, similar to how we define the resource up top here. Effect allow. Oh, I'm sorry. We have 3 different effects actions that we're defining here. The reason I separated the list bucket one, I think the S3 sync command needs it, so we define it here. And the reason it's separated is because for the resource, I just define the ARN without the path, because it doesn't need a path. When you're listing the bucket, you're listing everything in the bucket. Allow, and then this last action is CloudFront create invalidation. So when we push a new change, if you want the change to appear immediately, you need to create an invalidation. If you don't do that, let's say you push a change, okay? You'll have new files. But if the CloudFront has already cached files with those same names, it's not going to serve the most up-to-date files to the end user. This is going to serve the old one until that TTL expires, which is here, default. So I think that's a day. So if you don't mind the updates not being there for potentially a whole day, then I guess you don't need this. But actually, the problem with that is if you make a change to one file and then another file like requires the changed file, and now and you make some breaking change, then it's going to still be broken because it's going to be referring to the old file. So either you create invalidations or you set up a system where your files are always like a different file name, but I haven't thought that through completely. So anyway, and then as for the resource, we add the CloudFront ARN. We're running out of breath here. So GitHub Actions Role, we did that. Okay, website www redirect. So this is, as you might imply, it's a bucket to redirect any www calls. So as you can see, the domain is, there's no www, it's just nabware.com. If I didn't set this up, the wwws would, you'd result in an error. It'd say, the DNS, the browser would say that's not a website. And so just to demo this, well, it's taking some time. Maybe we've run into an error. Okay, no, there you go. As you can see, it resolved to nabware.com. Basically, you can set up a bucket as a static website, and then in Route 53, you point the www to the domain name of this bucket. So similar to how you set up the other bucket with the blocking public access, except you add this website configuration. You say redirect all requests to hostname, your nabware.com or whatever your hostname is, and protocol HTTPS. And then the bucket name, you have to name it the domain that you're redirecting. This has to do with the fact if you're doing website configuration, this needs to be the name of the website, I believe. I used to also have a CloudFront associated with this, and when I was remaking this project, I couldn't figure out why. I couldn't remember why I did that. This seems to work, but just know that sometimes you also put a CloudFront, another CloudFront distribution in front of this bucket. So yeah, that's that. Okay, last stage here, main YAML. So we have our ReactKit website, and we have our AWS infrastructure. Now we just need to set up the continuous integration and deployment. So let's pull up our main YAML. Okay, so you give it a name main, and then we want this to run on when I say git push, but I only want it to run on the main branch. So if I create a dev branch and I say git push, I don't want this to trigger when that happens. So we're restricting it to the main branch. env, so you need to declare some variables here that we're going to use below. So this is where when we have the outputs in our template file, you would paste that information in here. So bucket name, you need the website bucket name. You paste that in there. The region, you can statically type this, whatever region your resources are in. CloudFront Distribution ID, so the ID of it, and then role to assume. Aha, this is where the role is used. I was getting confused earlier. Oh boy, my voice is going out. So this is where you would take this ARN and paste it in here. So yeah. So jobs, deploy, runs on Ubuntu latest, so we're going to run this on Linux. Permissions, again, I'll mention I'm not an expert with GitHub Actions, but you need this, as it states in the comments. These permissions are needed to interact with GitHub's OIDC token endpoint, and then contents read. This is required for actions checkout. So I wish I could tell you more about how that works, but that's that. And then the steps. So steps uses actions checkout. So this is a predefined set of commands that GitHub Actions will do, and this will get our source code from our repository. Then we also need to set up Node, because remember our SvelteKit, it is built off Node, so we need Node. You can define the version here. I tried version 14 and I ran into some errors, so I upped it to 16, and that's what I'm using on my computer also, so that may be why. So I have it at 16. Then we want to just run npm install and npm run build. That's gonna, remember, build our Svelte app, and if you go back to the package.json, it's going to run this command. It's going to generate our favicons. It's going to generate our sitemap file. Okay, and then we're ready. We just need to upload everything and build to our bucket. So we say uses AWS Actions configure AWS credentials. So this is where we're using the role ARN to set up the AWS credentials. So you need to role to assume and the AWS region. Then we run our commands. So we run our sync command, AWS S3 sync. So we're saying sync everything in the build folder, which we just built, with our bucket, and delete. So the delete parameter, which I kind of referred to earlier, this if there's files in the bucket that do not exist in the build folder, then it will delete them. If there's a reason you wouldn't want that, then obviously you don't need to have this, but I think that's probably good to keep everything in sync. And then the last thing is to create an invalidation. So again, this refers to the fact that if you don't do this and you push an update and CloudFront has already cached files, you're not going to see the updates for a whole day or whatever you set the TTL to. So you'll see I say create invalidation, I give it the distribution ID, and then I set the paths to invalidate, meaning clear the cache for these paths. So here I'll just mention that I believe pricing for the invalidations is per path, meaning AWS gives you 1,000 free invalidation paths a month. So I think this counts as 3. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it does. So I have the wildcard, everything in the first directory. The reason I had this was because I had some other stacks that were using the same CloudFront, and I didn't want to invalidate their paths. So I only invalidated everything in the first directory, which is where my website would rely. And then everything in the app folder, which is, again, where SvelteKit has all the JavaScript stuff, I believe. And then I also had to add index.html because for some reason, I think it's because it's the CloudFront default root object. For some reason, the invalidation was not invalidating that. And again, so you can play around with this. You could theoretically get rid of this app and then get rid of this first dash or slash, and then that kind of reduces the amount of path calls you're making. So that's that. So yeah, and then that's that. So when I do commits and push, this is going to execute, and you'll see the changes here. And the last thing I'll just talk about is I have on this list is badge. So, you want to seem legit. So this is my README, and you'll notice on repositories and probably just websites in general that like there are these little badges. Actually, can I just show you? I guess I don't see why not. Here, main passing. Okay, so you want to know when you push an update. The idea with continuous integration, I think, and deployment is you push the update and then you just wait and see if it passes. And if everything passes, then you can continue developing. And if not, you either need to revert the changes or fix it. So anyway, this badge, the way you do this is this. I just copy and pasted that from the GitHub website. So yeah, I think I've probably gone on long enough. This is how to make a website with SvelteKit and AWS. Thank you for watching.